Welcome everyone to today's session with Dani and Yasser. You're welcome here in this open and friendly space, regardless of race, ethnicity, gender, orientation. All are welcome. Come as you are. So please try to make space for others. Feel free to participate to the extent that makes you feel comfortable, whether it be by texting in the chat, opening your camera or your mic if you feel like you want to. Always try to assume positive intentions and always try to aim to critique ideas, not people. You can also contribute to our community agreements. And one last note is during breakout rooms and activities, always feel free if you don't feel like participating. There's always be a quiet room on the standby. You can always message any of our co-hosts, including me, Noreen, Yasser, Dani, or Jenny Michaels. And that's it. You can go ahead, Dani and Yasser.
Thanks, sir. Thanks, sir. So I'm going to share our slides, and we'll also put a link to them in the chat in case folks need to access them. So let me grab that link. Oh, there we go. And welcome everyone. So this is our kind of hands-on session, a practical guide to accessibility and universal design for learning, practices, possibilities, and pitfalls. And I'll quickly introduce myself first and then pass it to Yasser, but I'm Dani Dilkes. I'm an educational developer. I work at an institution in Southwestern Ontario, Canada. And my portfolio here is sort of split between generative AI and accessibility and inclusive teaching. So this is very, very near and dear to my heart, this work. I am, however, somebody who holds a lot of privilege in educational spaces, which I like to acknowledge when I am speaking about this. So a lot of my understanding of barriers in educational spaces is learned rather than through my own lived experience. Most of my visible identities are ones that hold a lot of privilege. I do hold invisible identities. I'm neurodivergent, I'm queer, and these are things that don't necessarily present a lot of barriers for me because I can present and mask in a way that the barriers don't impede my my ability to engage in education. And I'm going to pass it to Yasser to introduce himself.
Thank you, Dani, and thank you to Noreen and Jenny for hosting. My name is Yasser Tamer Atef. I'm a student at the American University in Cairo. I'm the MYFest program support intern here with Equity Unbound. I'm an accessibility and disability advocate, and I also will present today a different background on all what we're going to talk about today, because my perspective is shaped by my identity, which is Arab in nature, and which is also represented by me speaking different languages, interacting with different people and different and different conditions. I received all my high school schooling education starting from elementary until high school in Arabic, and I then moved to higher education where I am affiliated to a AUC, which is an English medium of instruction institution. Today we're gonna revisit some terms related to the sessions. We're gonna deal with a lot of steps that have to do with accessibility and UTL. And we're gonna also work on our own material. And we have some example material that we're going to be addressing today. Over to Dani.
So Yasser and I sort of discussed what our goals were for this session, and we acknowledge that folks here might not be here because of these goals, but the way that we envision the session, the way that we plan the session was based around 4 learning outcomes, which are to be able to explain different approaches to accessible pedagogy and examine their underlying beliefs. So we'll look at accommodation as well as universal design, as well as design justice. To be able to apply the 3 principles of universal design to an educational design, either from your own context. So if you came with materials that you're actually working on in real life, you're welcome to use those. Or we do have examples that you can work from. To reflect on where you hold power to enact change and to influence change. So a lot of these conversations often come down to, well, I can't change this. and people get stuck on the things that they can't change. So we're going to hopefully spend a little bit of time discussing and empowering ourselves to know, even if it's a tiny change, where we do have that agency to make change. And then finally, at the end, Yasser will walk us through a speculative exercise, inviting you to imagine what a truly inclusive learning environment would look like. Before we jump into it, though, and I know that Noreen and Jenny have already done this sort of in talking about the community agreement, but we also wanted to sort of establish our own invitation to engage. As was already mentioned, you may participate in whatever way works for you today. In the session, we're a small group. We would love to hear people speak aloud. You're welcome to raise your hand at any point and jump into the conversation. We value contributions in the chat just as much. So please do use the chat if you wish to contribute. We will pause and most likely read aloud your contributions to the chat. And you're also very welcome to participate silently. So when there are breakout rooms, if you wish to work in a quiet room, that's great. And if you just want to be here to sort of listen to the conversation, that's a wonderful way to participate. When we do use breakout rooms, you may choose to participate either in a collaborative or a quiet room. There isn't a lot of very jargony words. This isn't like a theoretical presentation, but when we do introduce new terms, we will explain them. If either Yasser or I use a word that is unfamiliar to you, please let us know, because it's likely it's unfamiliar to other people. And sometimes you can get caught up when you're so involved in these conversations in assuming that some things are common knowledge when they're not. So please let us know so we can correct that. There are going to be some diagrams throughout the slides, and we will describe the key images in the slides when they come up. Images that are more decorative, we're not going to pause and describe, though. In the discussion, you only need to share what you're comfortable sharing. So again, choose the level of participation that works for you today. And then finally, nothing we are sharing here is really meant to be presented as absolute truth. So we do invite critical engagement with the ideas. We invite people to sort of challenge the way that we've positioned or framed some of these different approaches to inclusive pedagogy. And we'd love to hear from you if you have different thoughts on these ideas. So now I'm going to pass it to, actually, no, I think this slide is still me, and I'll pass it to Yasser after this. So before we jump in, we wanted to invite individual reflection. And the title of this reflection is called The One That Always Stays With Me. And it's really about sort of thinking back on your experience in education, either as an educator or as a student, and thinking about those defining moments, those defining stories that change how you understand education, how you approach education, and how you practice teaching and learning. So we're going to give everyone 2 minutes to reflect and to write in response to the following question, which is reflect on a defining moment that shaped your teaching practice. And Noreen has already dropped on the chat. Thank you, Noreen. And so if you are a person who wants to write, you're welcome to grab a piece of paper and a pen, open a Word doc. If you just want to think, that's great too. And then we will invite you to share in the chat after 2 minutes. But again, only if you're comfortable sharing. But I invite you to turn off your webcams, mute your mics, take 2 minutes to reflect on this question. Again, a defining moment that shaped your teaching practice. All right, that is our 2 minutes. So if anyone wants to share, and again, the slide says share in the chat, but if you also want to raise your hand and share out loud, we'd invite anyone to share. Or if everyone wants to keep the reflections to themselves, that's great too. Does anyone want to share? Folks are typing. I'm going to give you a minute. I'll actually share. Oh, Caitlin has shared. Caitlin, so if you don't mind, I'm going to read your contribution aloud, but not sure if this is on the right track, but in my role, I support facilitators who teach courses. And I remember working with one facilitator who had received feedback about only reading off slides and not doing a great job at it. With that feedback in hand, I had a conversation with her, trying my best not to assume anything, but very curious as to why she was struggling. She disclosed a learning disability to me and noted that it was a struggle to switch between live, free-flowing dialogue and a script. This really got me thinking about how to best support facilitators and students for that matter with learning disabilities without having them to feel the need to disclose. I think this is actually such an important question because so often our approach to accessibility is who's in my classroom and what do they need? Which isn't necessarily a bad way of thinking about it, but so often that puts the burden of disclosure on the students and sort of stigmatizes their needs or on facilitators. During COVID, I actually was supporting a program. I won't name which program, but I was supporting a program at my institution with the rapid pivot to online. And I really emphasized the need for us to put captions in all of our videos. And the program told me, well, we don't have any students who have disclosed that need, so we're not going to do it. And this is one of those stories that always stays with me, like that very basic lack of understanding of if you don't invite people into the space by creating this, like an inviting space for them, then they're not going to come. So thank you for sharing. And Robin, I see you have your hand.
Robin, yeah.
Oh, sorry, Yasser.
No, I was saying Robin had his hand up, sorry, yeah.
I was just gonna say, I think that for me, it's been a lot of it just like taking my whole experience as a student and a lot of like self-esteem with how to learn with a learning disability, all of that stuff, and how that affected me, and then a determination to get a undergraduate degree in science. So I kept forcing myself over and over to retake classes that I wasn't inherently gifted in at all. And then like at some point someone had to explain to me how our brains develop, and sometimes we simply don't have the capacity to learn something at one point, but if we're a little bit older and we tackle it, we can. And I remember the number I, the imaginary number, I had struggled with that. I just could not get in. I failed pre-cal because of it. Well, not just that, but finally understanding it and then like having it like come full circle, like oh my gosh, it just like a light bulb moment of like, okay, well, if it's explained in a different way and I'm ready in a different way, like it works better. I don't know.
I think what your story really highlights for me, Robin, is this idea that we get into these fixed mindsets about what we are or aren't capable of, or often institutions will impose them on other people. But we can always grow and change, and sort of like shifting the mindset that if I can't learn this right now or I can't do this right now, that's not a permanent state. So thank you so much for sharing. And I also really struggled with math and imaginary numbers. So I was just having a conversation with somebody about how calculus was my worst course in university. So I also can empathize with that. Charles has shared in the chat a grad school class with 30+ students where a third of the grade was participation. I felt too uncomfortable to really speak in such a large group. Now I try and keep that in mind when I have to include a participation grade in my courses and try to find alternative ways of including people. I love that. I'm also not a participator in large groups. When facilitating, I don't often come across as an introvert, but I am actually an introvert to my core. And spaces where people have to talk in large groups can just immediately introduce a barrier. And when we're grading that, like basically that introversion, extroversion, that social acuity, that's definitely an example of a hidden curriculum. And Dani shares, I had a student come to me in tears because he was failing my course due to the number of assignments he missed. He got behind due to an event in his personal life and couldn't figure out how to catch up. I realized then that students should have a chance to learn and not only on my schedule. And Jenny, you and I have chatted about this before, and I've learned so much about you about that idea of schedule flexibility, because I think about that all the time. Even in workshops, when you have an agenda, like building in that flexibility to meet the needs of individuals instead of saying, well, you're here, my plan says we have 10 minutes for this, so you have 10 minutes for it, so let's move on. So Jenny, I so appreciate that. All right. So thank you for sharing. And for those who may have reflected but not shared, thank you for your reflections. Yasser's going to talk us through now some of the terminology, starting with thinking about some of these basic terms, access and accessibility, just to make sure that everyone is sort of at the same starting point for some of this language. So I'll pass it to Yasser.
When we are thinking about those terms, we often think about accessibility, access, disability, and I'm going to walk you through some definitions that in our opinion, that we believe that they are the working definitions for how it should be, and we understand that sometimes in certain places it's not like that, but we're just trying to get a little bit more into what they should mean rather than what they are, like, I mean, the current state. So for access and accessibility, we believe that accessibility goes beyond access because it always requires dignity, independence, integration, and equal opportunity. And for me, when I say accessibility, we don't like we say that we should have accessibility, not access, because accessibility ensures that also inclusion is taken into consideration. But for disability, and here the definitions are a lot, and we've chosen two definitions. They aren't great, they aren't the best, but we've chosen them to challenge them and to get into a little bit of an explanation as to why they are defined as such. So the first definition is the government of Quebec's in Canada, and the government of Quebec defines disability as a person's reduced ability to carry out an activity, to function intellectually, psychologically, or is this like psychologically or anatomically? And this definition is very much tied to the medical model, and I definitely don't agree with it 100%, because disability also has a little bit of a societal responsibility, because a disability comes back to society, and if the society removes all the barrier that I, as a disabled, totally blind person, I'm exposed to, then my disability is kind of, yes, I'm living with my disability, I'm proud of it, but then I'm included in society. I can still walk, I can still enjoy education, I can still have the full right of employment, I can still do any task, because there is accessibility, there's a full inclusion of that I have access to all the services and material, and there is the idea that the society is adapted to suit my needs as a disabled person. The other definitions that we're working with is the United Nations, and it defines disability as something that results from an interaction between persons with impairments and attitudinal and environmental barriers that hinder their full and effective participation in society on an equal basis with others. And this is also better. It's better than the government of Quebec's, because it acknowledges the society and it acknowledges the the impairment, but it still says impairment and still mentions barriers. And I would say it's better than the government of Quebec, but it's still also not, it still doesn't capture the full picture of disability. we're gonna stop if someone would like to share something. If not, I'm going to also go ahead and go through the medical and social model. But I want to make sure that we're all on the right track, or if somebody has any question. Okay. So I'll assume it's going well until now. So I'm gonna go ahead and uh, go through the medical model. And in the medical model, we say that disability exists within the person or body, and disability is an impairment that needs to be addressed. And for me, this kind of ties back to the United Nations disability because it mentions impairment, and it also mentioned that disability is an individual problem. And here too, we have the idea of an individual problem. If we are going to ask about the solution for that, I would say the solution would be accommodation, and we're going to talk about accommodation. But to just explain it very briefly here, we would say that accommodation provides individual support on a case by case basis. And we have a slide here that Dani is going to walk us through when we come to explain accommodation. But also, we shouldn't forget that accommodation should be reactive, and it should create like sometimes it is reactive, and it creates additional time and finance burden for individuals. So for the social model, uh, it's actually the the opposite of the medical model, because it says that disability is actually a mismatch between the person and an environment. And I'm a social model person, so I agree with this 100%. I agree that disability occurs through mismatches between the person and their environment. I live here in Egypt. I can tell you that 100% of my time walking in the streets, I have to either take an Uber or just use a car or use a bus or anything, because sidewalks aren't inclusive, aren't accessible. And therefore, if they were accessible, I wouldn't have had to do the idea of navigating with those like expensive modes of transportation. So I'm a social model person. This is my perspective, so I might be also biased to it. So I also have to to address this. The social model also acknowledged that disability is a difference, not a deficiency. And this is what I was hinting at earlier about the idea of society acknowledging that it's a deficiency in the society and it should be also addressed. Now it says it's a difference, and the difference goes back to kind of physical abilities rather than societal capabilities. Disability is a social problem, and the solution is it needs to be collective. Yes, the solution needs to be collective, but also it should start from the society, from the CBR, which is community-based, like there's something called CBR, community-based rehabilitation. It is actually what it's similar to the different professional development that happens, but it says that disabled people, step up and help their peers, and it's from the from the community to the community. And it also goes to talk about rehabilitation, which is if somebody, for example, goes blind, if somebody who goes blind recently, they support them without waiting for the government support or the institution support. If someone lost a hand or something, so then they need to also go through rehabilitation, and then that comes from the community. I see that Caitlin has something in the chat, so I'm gonna hand this to Dani so she can read us what is in there.
So Caitlin, who is based in Canada like me, says, I wish more institutions, governments, educational institutions, etc., looked at accessibility through the social model of disability. At least here in Canada, it's very much an individual and often very expensive burden on the disabled person problem. Yes, 100%, Caitlin. And a lot of what Yasser and I are going to be talking about are the tensions between like the accommodation, the individualized accommodation process, which in its of itself is exclusionary because it's sort of defined, these are the acceptable ways of being disabled that we will accommodate for. And a lot of people are left out of that model. But there's also the time it takes to get all the documentation that you need, the additional emotional burden of disclosing and discussing your needs with others, and the giving away of agency. So yes, I wish too that everyone, but institutions in particular, looked at accessibility through this lens. And yeah, sure, I'll pass it back to you in case you want to respond as well.
Sure. Yes, I second your thought, all your thoughts, Danny and Caitlin. There is something that I love to say in these contexts, where I always say disabled people everywhere will have problems, no matter the support you're going to give them. So I live in Egypt, I live in Cairo. As I said, I always have a hard time commuting unless I Uber or unless I take a taxi or something. When prior to joining AUC, I also had issues accessing school books because I had like the Ministry of Education books weren't as supportive enough for me for my education, so I had to pay for extra materials to be printed in Braille and be made accessible to me. So all of this is kind of existing barriers that I had to deal with. On the other hand, if I travel to Canada and they give me one of those support as a person, I wouldn't be requiring like a guide dog. I wouldn't be requiring something like a tactile graph to study science because I haven't been exposed to these before. What I would require is like basic support. I would honestly be proud of that support because I come from a background that through which I haven't been provided this before, and when I am provided this in Canada or elsewhere, it makes a huge difference. I also say that disabled people have problems such as guide dog refusals for the blind. And here in Egypt, guide dogs are normalized. And when somebody talks to me about, oh, I had a guide dog refusal through like an Uber or a McDonald's or something, and it made me stressed. I had to leave my dog behind or something like that. Then I don't feel the weight of this. I don't feel the stress of this because I haven't had the feeling of guide dog access. I haven't had access to a guide dog, and therefore I can't empathize enough with this. And therefore, this takes me to a point here which says like the solution for this would be this universal design for learning and accessibility. And we would want to reimagine the design that offers more flexibility and more choice. And by the way, the universal design isn't the best. The universal design, I'm not saying that it's the best approach, but at least it offers some proactive and collective decision sort of making that enables us to have more independence and integration. Going to refer back to Dani here, so she can also continue with the slides.
So with the idea of sort of the social model and accessibility being a design concern, we were going to invite people to engage in what might seem like a slightly distasteful activity, but we're going to ask you to participate in a non-inclusive design activity. And Yasser, do you want to walk us through this, or do you want me to do this one?
So basically, I've been inspired by the TRIZ liberating structure, and some of you might know it, some of you might not, but it's basically working through the backward design. So instead of jumping to the conclusion of how can we design an inclusive system or an inclusive classroom, we are doing the other way around. So in breakout room, we need to think about the following question. How can we design a non-inclusive, unjust, most exclusionary ever most exclusionary most exclusionary classroom? We also would like to think about the elements, the essential elements that minimize the sense of belonging there, and how this also could, you know, prevent any kind of inclusion or ensure that the students will be successful. I believe Noreen or Jenny have the breakout rooms ready. If yes, we will be happy to go to breakout rooms. If somebody has questions, also we'll be happy to answer questions.
If you want to go to a quiet room, send me a message now. I am trying to figure out, we have 4 participants and then the co-host. So should I just put all of us into rooms?
So 6,
I could,
that's 3, 2 rooms, 3 per room, I would say, unless Danny has something.
No, I'm happy with that.
okay.
And then obviously for anyone who wants to be in the quiet room, that would slightly change those numbers, but
Yeah.
Let's see. I'm gonna do.
I can briefly just speak to, in our group, there were lots of really interesting conversations on barriers, but I think the consensus, and I invite any of my group members to jump in as well, but the consensus was, it's sad how many of these things we're already doing. So it was just a collection of, this is bad, this will make it inclusive or uninclusive, this will lack belonging, and then we're like, yeah, this is happening, this is happening, this is happening. So it was a very interesting task for sort of revealing that we're already doing all of the bad things. I don't know, Yasser, if anyone from group 2 also wants to share, or if anyone from group 1 wants to correct or comment on what I just said.
Yeah, I think something we talked about in group 1 was just, unfortunately, like how much easier it was to think of how to make a space, like a classroom place, like less inclusive than it was to think of like how to make it more inclusive, which is kind of sad as a society.
Yes, Caitlin. And I think it's like the human thing of it also, like our brains sometimes live in dark spaces, so that also is why it can be easier. But I think that's why the TRIZ idea or the sort of like hostile design idea can be very helpful, because it is really easy to do that. And then you can move on to thinking about, okay, so how do we do things differently? So Robin, thank you for sharing, Robin.
Yeah.
All right. So part of the point of the activity, which could be somewhat a harrowing activity, but is to start to think about, okay, so if these are the problems, and a lot of these problems are things that we are already doing, how do we fix them? And as Yasser mentioned, when we think about disability through the medical model, the most common or the most obvious solution is accommodation. And accommodation is essentially removing or reducing barriers on an individual basis. So working with an individual to see what needs do they have that are not being met, and then finding a solution just for them to ensure that they can access and participate in existing systems. And this process, as we've already sort of started discussing, often requires the individual to disclose a need, request an accommodation. Yasser earlier talked about sort of how part of accessibility is dignity and independence and agency, and often accommodation requests sort of come up in tension with these ideas, where suddenly a person is reliant on a system or another individual to help them get their needs met. But it is actually really the most commonly legislated form of accessibility, where a lot of human rights legislation requires what is quote unquote reasonable accommodation, including the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. In my own context in Canada, we have the AODA, which is the Access for Ontarians with Disabilities Act. So this is sort of encoded in law. This is what the law says is the right thing to do. I have an image here, it's just from Unsplash, but it's of a mobile ramp where there is a woman next to a pair of steps, and she's putting a ramp for a mobility device in order to enter the house. And when we think about accommodation through this lens, what's really important here is that the person who's using a mobility device does not inherently have access to the space. They need to go through the additional time and emotional labor of asking somebody to pull out this ramp, depending on somebody else to set it up for them. So we're seeing a lot of tensions here on that idea of like agency and belonging. We're saying, well, sure, you can come in, but it's not really designed for you. So this is interesting way of thinking about how accommodation might not be the best approach to accessibility. And then I'm going to pass it. Oh, did I lose a slide? Yes. Okay. So I'm not saying that all accommodation models are bad. Accommodation models are necessary because other forms of inclusive design won't necessarily address all barriers to access. Accommodation, and one of the reasons why it is sort of widespread as an approach to accessibility, it does acknowledge and address the needs of individuals. It can enable greater participation in society, work, and education, so it can help address some of those designed barriers. But it results in access fatigue, which means that the people who need to request accommodation, who are already experiencing barriers in society, suddenly need to do more to get equitable access. So we're asking them to take more time, engage in more dialogue. Like it's so much more work for them to get the same basic access that other folks get. Accommodation, especially in higher education spaces, is very reactive, and it can take significant time to navigate accommodation processes. So I sit on a number of committees at my institution related to accessibility, including the group who deals with course materials and making course materials more accessible. And they've said that quite often, in order to get an accessible copy of a course text or a copy translated into Braille, it can be 2 or 3 months into a 4-month course before students have access to those materials. So you can imagine that the actual equitable ability for those students to engage in learning is impeded greatly because these processes are so time consuming. And then finally, the accommodation process inherently is othering, because it sort of has said like, this group of people who don't need accommodations, they're normal. And our system is designed for this normal. And anyone who doesn't fall into this understanding of normal, well, we can still let them participate. We can still help them out, but they need to go through this process because they have, and I'll use air quotes, special needs or different needs. And so by the very way that accommodation is established, we're creating sort of who does belong and who doesn't belong, but we're going to allow them to be in these spaces. So we wanted to emphasize, again, there are some benefits, there are some needs for accommodation models, but at least from Yasser and my point of view, it should not be the fundamental way that we're approaching accessibility. I'm going to pass it to Yasser. I think he's going to talk about sort of a different way of thinking about this, aligning more with the social model.
Before we do this, though, Charles, I think, had something interesting in the chat.
Thank you, Yasser. I was not focusing on the chat. So Charles writes, where I work, there are several short flights of stairs along this one corridor. The college recently installed elevators to make this route more accessible, but to use them, you have to get a staff member with the right dongle to come down and operate them. Oh, yes. This is actually a really big example of sort of non-agentic accessibility, where we're sort of creating this system where people need to rely on others. Earlier in the slide, so I flipped back a number of slides to the access versus accessibility slide, there was a picture that we didn't describe, but it was a similar thing where in a campus bookstore at a university that I am affiliated with, the bookstore does not have accessible access to the upper floors. It's a 3-floor bookstore. And so it has a sign that says, elevators, please ask for assistance. And the only elevators that are available are actually the service elevators, sort of in the back supply room. So another example of, well, it's accessible, they can get to the top floors, but we're not really embodying dignity and independence and all of these really important foundational things if we're thinking about accessibility as a sense of belonging. And then Caitlin writes, so nice to see you mention access fatigue. It's utterly exhausting of having to continuously advocate for yourself and your accommodations. And that is in a lot of the work that I do, Caitlin, and maybe similar to your own experiences, that's such a big piece that's unseen because institutions are meeting their reasonable accommodation requirement, the law says they have to do, but they're not really thinking about what that actually means in terms of the experience of those who are seeking accommodation. And then Robin writes, I had to request permission not to attend a large indoor event due to PTSD anxiety, and it took weeks to get everything lined up. I had to have a doctor's note and then interview with HR. Wow, that's again, that same idea of access fatigue and also the stigma associated with it. I think in our institution, PTSD and anxiety would not fall under our accommodation process. So there would be nothing put into place through like the formal processes to address sort of some of the barriers that can result in mismatches between PTSD and anxiety in large events or noisy places and all of that. So I'm sorry you had that experience. I think that was everything in the chat. But so Yasser, now I will pass it over to you to talk about universal design for learning.
So we just thought that after talking about the accommodation, we would, talk about the universal design, which is actually one of the solutions that we've included under the social model. And the universal design for learning is actually adapted from the concepts of universal design in the field of architecture. And it is actually the design of products and environments to be usable by all people to the greatest extent possible without the need for adaptation or specialized design. And as I said, this kind of has its own limitation, but it's still a very good and interesting way to look at how we can leverage that universal design for learning. Here's a quote that also we've included. So I'm gonna read it, and we loved included in the slides. It says the design of products and environments. Okay, I read this. So actually, the universal design draws on the cognitive neuroscience and the beliefs that there's predictable variability in how learners learn. And this is kind of true because if you're going to ask a blind person to use Braille and another blind person to use the same Braille that the first blind person used, this is not universal design. Because even though blind people are the same, have the same disability, they might not have the same preference. So while I'm facilitating the session, I am using my Braille display device on my left hand side, and I have access to it, which allows me to read off the slides. This connected through a Bluetooth connection using my computer. So this device here, is definitely expensive, and if I hadn't had much support to get that device, I wouldn't have been able to be able to read and follow along the content. But I can't forget the idea that some people might not like that idea. Some people might say, I am an audio material person, so I don't like the Braille display. I always like my material to be audio taped or audio recorded. So you can't give a person a Braille display unless they actually do. And the goal for from all of this is to empower learner agency, and learner agency is a big sort of aspect, and to offer them actual choices as to how they would like to learn. Because if you're offering your students if you're assigning your students infographics without making sure that you have an alternative accessible assignment, then you're creating a barrier. Actually, the universal design is when it comes to the organization of the framework, it's actually organized into 3 overlapping principles, and we're going to talk about them one by one. So the multiple means of representation, the multiple means of engagement, and the multiple means of action and expression. And I'm going to refer back to Dani so she can walk us through the representation part.
Dani, your mic's off.
You're muted.
I was talking so animatedly too. I'm sure I said brilliant things. What I was saying was, before we jump into the principles and sort of the nuances of each principle, we just wanted to introduce the next activity so folks can think about how they might want to engage in the activity. And the way the activity will be organized is around each of the principles. We'll introduce the principle, sort of talk about some of the practices related to that principle. And then we'll be inviting you into a breakout room to look at either, if you brought your own materials and how that principle might apply to improving them, or we'll be providing mock course outlines where you can kind of think about how that principle might apply. And then so you'll have 8 minutes for each principle in the breakout rooms to sort of think about it, and then we'll come back and we'll talk about the next principle. And you can also share your own examples, and or you could choose to share your own examples, or you can, as we've already mentioned, choose to work independently, and we'll put you in a quiet room. So this is sort of what you can expect as the next chunk of our workshop. When we do get to the cases, and I wanted to just share these in advance so you can start to think about them, there are 3 possible cases you could choose to work on. So case number 1 is a nutrition and food science course. The course is structured as an in-person course with a lab and a lecture component. The assignments for the course include participation, labs, a midterm exam, and a final exam. Case number 2 is a media and society course. It is a synchronous online course that's conducted over Zoom. And the assessments for this course include weekly case study presentations, weekly asynchronous discussions, and 2 papers. And the third case, or the third course example, is a leadership and organizational behavior course that consists of a weekly in-person seminar. And the assessments include professionalism and participation, 3 case analyses, and a group presentation. So just wanted to sort of introduce those so you can start to think about them before we jump into the principles and the activity. And now, as Yasser said, I will talk about multiple means of representation. So multiple means of representation really focuses on the what of learning, so the content and the format of the content that we're using in our classes. I would say when we talk about universal design for learning, multiple means of representation aligns most clearly with kind of other accessibility guidelines or frameworks, like WCAG, which is the Web Content Accessibility Guide that dictates sort of what font sizes you should use, what colors you should use, what font styles you should use. It does go beyond that, but when we think about accessibility through that sort of digital accessibility lens, most of that falls into multiple means of representation. And multiple means of representation asks us as educators or as learning designers to recognize that learners differ in how they perceive and process information, how they comprehend symbols, language, and media. And in our kind of bad design breakout room, we talked a lot about language and how language presents barriers. And multiple means of representation also asks that we recognize that learners differ in how they build meaning from instructional content. So some things to consider when you're thinking about applying multiple means or creating multiple means of representation in your courses is possibly choosing or designing or choosing materials that offer multiple formats. So making sure that you're presenting things not just in one modality, but in text and audio and visual and tactile and whatever formats might make sense for both your audience and the content. But more important than that is also offering things in formats where the users have the ability to actually change the settings. So often in my context, that means making sure you share a Word document, which people can edit, versus a PDF, which is very challenging for someone to edit. But with a Word document, an individual can decide, okay, well, I want to put this Word document into a text to audio tool, or I want to totally change the font size or the color of that. So it gives them maximum agency to manipulate that digital content. Another consideration for multiple means of representation is thinking about the language that we use and making sure that we use language and symbols that are culturally inclusive. So it might be something like avoiding culturally specific anecdotes, or I tend to often refer to, I'm getting old, I tend to refer to TV shows of my teens, which nobody knows about anymore, but kind of avoiding those cultural references is a part of this. But also offering glossaries, defining jargon. If you use an acronym, tell somebody what that acronym means, because acronyms are the worst for barriers of understandability, because we throw them around and often people can't even define what an acronym is anymore. And just really being cognizant of the language that we're using and using simple language wherever possible. Finally, the last consideration is providing opportunities for learners to construct understanding through discussion, through analogy, through storytelling, and allowing them to actually draw from their own lived experiences, their own frames of reference, their own background knowledge, in order to build on the content that we're sharing. So this is very much about inviting them in as people who already have knowledge into that co-construction of learning. And Yasser, I don't know if you wanted to add anything before we invite folks into the breakout rooms.
I'm fine, unless anyone has any question.
Charles writes, my program uses so many acronyms, I forget what they mean, let alone the students. When people use acronyms, I have a bad habit of just saying, can you tell me what that means? And more than 50% of the time, they cannot. They have to look it up, which I'm guilty of as well, but we use them as though they're words, and they can really obscure meaning. All right, so what we're going to do is invite folks back into the breakout rooms. I've shared in the chat the case outline. So what I've put in the chat is a Google Doc that contains course outlines for those 3 different courses that I mentioned. I think we'll put folks back into 2 different breakout rooms. If you'd like to be in a quiet room, please let us know. Once in your room, you'll have time to sort of look at the 3 cases, choose which one you want to focus on. And for this first round, you're going to think specifically about representation. And first, you're going to look at what barriers to representation can you identify in the case. So where does it create barriers to access that maybe are unnecessary? And then you're going to think about, so how do I fix it? So what changes can be made to offer more flexible content, to improve the language, to scaffold learning, or other ways you're interpreting multiple means of representation? So if there are no questions, we'll set up the breakout rooms.
Got them ready.
Talk to us about.
So
Go ahead, yes, sir.
here, okay, so after we've done the multiple means of representation, the second element would be the multiple means of engagement. And it kind of focuses on the why of learning, and this is a big deal because the reason behind why we are learning is really important. I've done a lot of assignments, I've been in a lot of classrooms, I've done a lot of tests, and I never understood why we were meant to learn that. And this principle recognizes that learners differ in what motivates them to engage. with learning. It also addresses how they respond to the to challenge or threat or even reward. So as I've been saying, I've been exposed to many classrooms, and all of these classrooms have been challenged, I've been assessed. Uh, I might have been rewarded, but at the time I didn't know why we were learning that. In in high school, we were learning some theoretical basics of algebra, but without the application. So we were sort of given the rules and memorizing them, and we never applied that into practice. We never had like some algebra actual problems to solve or something, or actual calculations. Therefore, my knowledge of that is very basic. The memorization part didn't make sense to me, and I didn't know why we are engaging in this. Also, the multiple means of engagement recognizes how actually students persist or regulate emotions and sustain attention. And this is also important because if we're teaching something that doesn't make any sense, it means that we're gonna lose their attention span after like 5 or 10 minutes. And this also has to do with all disabilities, blind people, neurodivergent, any disabilities. With that principle, there are a lot of considerations, and they go as follows. So we encourage people to create learning environments that support autonomy and relevance. So making sure that students are aware of why this is relevant to their own thinking or intellectual capacity, and why sort of we're learning this. So learners can make sense of the meaningful choices they are making and into their learning. We also have another consideration of incorporating joy, curiosity, and cultural response into our pedagogical tools. And this is really important. I haven't understood the meaning and the joy of learning until university time. And that was very late in my educational life, because when I stepped into a classroom and I found out that we have like a snack time into class, then I was really engaged to make that time as much as possible, because that time made allowed me to create a community with us with the colleagues in class. It wasn't about the snacks that we've been able to eat in the classroom. It was about speaking freely with the colleagues in classroom, knowing about their majors, because we're a liberal arts institution, knowing about their hobbies, lives, sports, preferences, all that. And sometimes we also, you know, we made friendships, and we acknowledged that sometimes that time was a learning for each other. We also try to, through the multiple means of engagement, acknowledge and reduce emotional or environmental barriers. So, for example, anxiety, uh, threat, inflexible deadlines. We try to minimize these as much as possible, so we can increase the impact of learning and motivation for our students. So this is basically the multiple means of engagement, and now we're gonna go back into the same groups, same breakout rooms, and address the engagement. And we want to think through the barriers to engagement. So we want to think through the barriers, like the question, what barriers to engagement can we identify in any case? Like if you've chosen the business case, think about that. If you've chosen the other couple of cases, think about that also. What changes can we make to that also? And how can we increase authenticity and and motivation for students? If somebody has if anyone has any question, I'm happy to answer. If not, I'm happy to go to breakout room.
Thank you. And Yasser, did you want to speak to action and expression, or do you want me to?
You can go ahead. Don't worry.
Okay. Bear with me 1 second to get my slides back up. So in many ways, action and expression, I find is one of the most fun things to really focus in on, because it has a lot to do with assessment. And I love critiquing assessment and complaining about assessment. We're not going to have a lot of time to do that here. But action and expression really focuses on the how of learning. So how are we actually demonstrating learning? How are we engaging in learning? And as a principle, it recognizes that learners differ in how they approach the learning process. And I do want to really emphasize this is not about learning styles. Learning styles is not a thing, but this is just about learning preferences and how learners like to kind of move through learning and set up their learning environments. This is also really about how learners express knowledge. So Vivian used the word epistemophilia, which I really like. I do a lot of work in epistemicide and epistemic justice. So understanding there is different ways of knowing, different ways of showing that you know, and we need to create spaces that honor all of those ways. And then finally, it recognizes that learners differ in how they navigate learning paths. So not all learners are going to move through our curriculum in the same way. There's a concept that I really love, coming from curriculum studies and as a curriculum nerd, called the curriculum as lived. So when we design a course, we often say, well, this is a learning experience. Every student who comes to my class is going to go through this curriculum. They're going to have exactly the same assignments, the same content, and they're going to end up at the same place. And this is a myth that we tell ourselves. Instead, if we think about curriculum as a lived experience, every person who moves through our courses is going to have a very different experience, no matter how much we try and control the learning outcomes, the content, the curriculum. And so part of multiple means of action expression is honoring curriculum as lived and honoring that there are as many different forms of our courses and our learning experiences as there are people in the classroom. So when we're thinking about applying multiple means of action and expression to our course designs, this means making design choices or designing learning environments that allow for different interaction needs. In our Zoom meeting, for example, it might be that we're inviting folks to share either in the chat or speaking out loud or silently. And not just allowing different options, but making sure that it's clear that all of those options are equally valued. So we're not prioritizing one type of action. Another consideration is also supporting different learning goals and progress monitoring. So again, this idea of learner agency and helping learners in navigating learning paths, enabling them to make their own decisions, but also supporting them in how to make those decisions, how to make sure they're progressing, and how to address places where maybe they stray off the paths that they've set for themselves. And so this is sort of this idea of how, not just how people participate in learning, but also how they demonstrate learning. So when I say it's tied to assessment, it may also be the types of assessments we set up. In my space, we really often prioritize written assessment as though writing is the only skill, the only way to demonstrate knowing. So thinking about, well, maybe there are other ways of expressing knowledge. Maybe there are other assessment types that have as much value that could reduce barriers for different learners who perhaps writing is not their strength. So we'll be thinking about this, returning to our same cases. But Yasser, did you want to add anything else to multiple means of action and expression?
I'm good, Dani. Thank you.
Okay. So going back into our rooms, we'll think about what barriers to action and expression you can identify in your case. And then if you have time, also think about sort of what changes can be made to allow for different ways of interacting in the learning process. What changes can be made to allow for different ways of demonstrating knowledge, and what changes can be made to allow for supporting individual goal setting and progression. And
I'm concerned about the time.
Yeah,
It's
I was gonna
46 and I think that we also don't have enough number for rooms. So I think if people have something to share, we can pause the recording and make it in the meeting.
Sure. So are you thinking that we won't go back into breakout rooms then, Yasser? Beyond?
Okay, there we go.
Sure. What we were trying to sort of end on is universal design helps with some of these problems. It's not a panacea. It's not going to fix everything. Sometimes people dig into universal design as though it will, which can be a problem because you're creating a bit more space, you're creating a bit more choice, but the power in that relationship still sits with the instructor to decide how much more choice, how much more flexibility. There's another paradigm that we're not going to have time to get into today called design justice or disability justice, where we're now shifting the power and the choice, the design decisions to students. But even as instructors in making these decisions, power comes into these conversations so often. I'm going to open up this like massive topic right before we end. But what we wanted to do is end a little bit on hope, where you might feel in some of these spaces, you don't have the power to make the changes that you want to make. You might not be able to apply all of the universal design for learning principles or apply all of the guidelines because of the power that you hold in a space, or because the institution or your department or your course or your physical and technological environments put limitations on what you can and can't do. So anytime we engage in conversations around being more accessible, we have to acknowledge power, and we have to acknowledge that we all hold power differently. So what I can do in my courses might be vastly different than what Yasser can do in his courses, or what Jenny can do in her courses, or Charles, what you can do in your courses. And that means that our practices might not align, our ways of being inclusive might not be the same. And it's also really important to acknowledge that power is not a binary. It's not a I have power or I don't have power. It's a where do I have power? Contextual constraints are the things that might impede your ability to evoke change. One that I hear about a lot in my work are grading policies. Courses that require grade averages to be between a certain range, courses that require a certain average at the end, courses that say you have to grade in a certain way. But other contextual constraints might be, I have classes of 2,200 students. I can't do one-on-one personal reflections as much as that might help foster belonging, help foster relationships. So being aware of this is also really important because when we butt up against these contextual constraints, it might result in us being a bit frozen and feeling like we can't take an action. What we want to end on and sort of encourage you to do is focus on your own scope of control. So this is what you can change immediately. And it might be that a student shows up 15 minutes late to class. The departmental policy says they don't get credit for that or for that attendance, but you could decide to maybe overlook or forget that they showed up late. So think about what you can change immediately, being cognizant of the potential for precarity and sort of what that impact might have on you. So rock the system only as much as you feel safe doing so. But we can also think about our scope of influence. So maybe where we don't have immediate control to make changes, but where we can plant seeds of greater change. So if these very restrictive attendance policies are creating a problem, tell people, talk about it, raise those issues so you can sort of evoke not just the immediate change of your classroom, but those larger changes in your institutions. And the diagram here is 3 embedded circles. The center is the circle of control. So again, that's what you can do immediately and nobody can stop you. The circle of influence is where you can plant seeds and sort of change how other people behave or change how systems behave. The circle of concern, we're not going to talk about too much, but this is what I call the doom scrolling circle of this is all the stuff that's wrong in the world and here's why it's wrong, but I can't do anything about it. And sometimes our brains fixate on that to the effect of not really invoking any sort of change at all. And we had some lovely activities. We're right at the hour, thinking about imagining better futures. But given that we have 1 minute left, I'll just flip right to the very last activity, which is called One Small Thing. and invite folks in our last minute to either ask questions, or if there's one small thing that you're taking away from today's session, one thing that you're going to do in your courses, one thing you're going to think about or investigate more, we invite you to share it with us. But I'll pass it also back to Yasser if you have anything left to add.
Yeah, I will be also sharing today on our Discord channel the speculative activity. I'll adapt it for Discord so we can also have a chat around it. And you know, if you've attended session one where we invited you to look at your surrounding environment and question the digital, social, educational, and digital barriers, you can go ahead and also still do that. And I'm also we as an official MyFest host, we appreciate receiving your feedback on the session. And I'm gonna also stop here so you can interact with this one small thing activity that Dani just mentioned.
I'm just gonna share. Noreen says that she's gonna reflect on what small change can you immediately. Oh, she wrote the reflection. And I was reading it. Thank you.
I like to write it down as much as I can. Vivian shared a response though.
Not giving up on trying to pursue equity despite hostile environments. Amazing. And Vivian, you and I have had many conversations. I know that you're doing amazing work kind of trying to push back against those hostile environments. So the world is lucky to have you doing that work.
You're a sweetheart. Thanks.
And if anyone else wants to share, please do. But otherwise, thank you all for joining us and for the great conversation. I really enjoyed the conversation today.